Good morning, everyone. This is a fantastic turnout. Thank you for coming, getting up early. Well, not that early, but early enough. As Najuma said, I'm Richard Flory. I'm the Senior Director of Research and Evaluation at CRCC. And this is the second of our conversations on thriving congregations, which is part of our Reimagining Church and Developing Thriving Congregations initiative, which is, as she said, as Najuma said, is funded by the Lilly Endowment. And will be ongoing for the next few years. For this conversation, because the importance of it, and the next one as well, right before the elections, we are opening this up to a broader audience than the grant originally intended. But we think that that's a good thing, and we want to include as many people as we can in these conversations. Our first conversation about a month ago, we had several guests who led us an extended set of conversations focused on how congregations can respond to crises by laying groundwork for reimagining themselves, and in the process identify and act on opportunities that a crisis presents, rather than focusing only on the problems and the challenges. We believe there's both. There's a great opportunity for rethinking one's organization in the middle of crisis. So today's conversation is focused on social justice and how that is related to thriving congregations. Yet another ongoing crisis that we believe churches and congregations of all faiths should approach as an opportunity to put their faith into action. With the developments over the last few months of the protests throughout the country over police violence, this is a pressing issue for churches and other faith organizations. And frankly, it's one that's contested terrain, both within and across faith traditions. There's a pastor of a very large church in the LA area who is adamantly anti-social justice, at least in the way that it's framed. Frankly, they use a lot of alt-right language, and that's not great in my view. By way of introducing today's conversation, I do want to share just a short story from my own life. I went to my undergraduate work at a Christian college here in the LA area, and I was a restless student, to say the least. I'm a pastor's kid, and I was trying to create my own identity right in the middle of a very conservative world where my dad was well known. My restlessness took on many different forms, but ultimately pushed me toward taking sociology courses, mainly because of the fun kinds of topics that these courses offered, such as classes on crime and criminality, race and ethnicity, urban studies, and other similar courses that you might call current issue oriented. In the process, though, those courses introduced me to a way of thinking that I had never really known, that is about how social forces and structures largely direct the kinds of opportunities and lack thereof that people have in life, despite the American ideology that you or I can be, quote, anything we want, so long as we work hard and attain our own success. As I noted, I was at an evangelical college, so this social forces way of thinking was pretty much moving against the primary cultural context of the school, although there were sometimes surprises, whether through classes or other people I knew on campus, people who were invited to campus to give a talk. And amazingly, as conservative as that school was and still remains, sometimes those visitors were really interesting. For example, and believe this or not, somewhere around 1978 or 79, Eldridge Cleaver was a chapel speaker. He was there to promote his book, Soul on Fire, and his, at the time, conversion to Christianity. Well, I don't remember anything about what he said. I do remember sitting there in the gym thinking that this was pretty cool. This was the guy I'd been reading about with the Black Panthers, and now he's actually speaking in chapel at this school. That alone made my rare chapel visits worthwhile. A year or so later, when I was in my final year of school, there was another speaker that I wanted to hear. Now, some of you may remember Reverend E.V. Hill, who was a pastor of Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church in Los Angeles. And he was also a Republican, which was probably how he got invited to speak in that chapel. But again, I have no memory of anything that he said, but whatever it was, there was some strange coalescence with my trying to figure myself out, what I was going to do after I graduated. And I distinctly remember saying to myself, I want to do something in the city. And of course, I had no idea what that meant, or how I would do that, or what I would or could do. And I didn't even have the vocabulary to frame this as some sort of desire to work for social justice, just that I wanted to do something, and the city seemed to be the place to do it. My guess is that most of us here today are somewhere like I was back in the 1970s. We want to do something about inequality, or to help bring about social justice for people who have historically had it denied to them, or to work toward bringing about flourishing in underserved communities or something similar, but we either have no idea what we could do or how to go about doing it. Or for those of you who have been working on these justice issues for a long time are unaware of where to go now, what with the 2 steps forward and 1 and now seemingly 2 steps back form of progress that we've witnessed not only over the last 50 plus years, but increasingly so over the last 4 years. So today our conversation focuses on social justice and thriving congregations because we know that congregations and their members have played a significant role in achieving justice goals in the past, and that they still have a role to play in that struggle, both prophetic and practical. I would say political, but I can't say that. And we believe that a thriving congregation accepts that role and seeks to fill it in a way that is consistent with its history and tradition and in contributing ways that only it can. Which is why we have our three guests here today, to help us think through what the relationship between thriving congregations and social justice is and can be, as well as the larger question of the role of faith groups in general and in seeking social justice for those who have never enjoyed its results. So the great thing, and I want to introduce our speakers briefly now and then turn it over to Najuma to lead the discussion. The great thing about organizing these conversations is that we get to sit around and think of people that we know or are aware of who would be really interesting and who will provide us with new ways of thinking about different issues and how they relate to religious life. I'm excited to listen to this conversation, not unlike those rare occasions when I go to chapel when I was in college. So briefly, our conversation partners today are first, Robert Chao Romero, who is an associate professor in the departments of Chicano Studies and Central America Studies and Asian American Studies at UCLA. And we love him anyway, even though he's at UCLA. And I first became aware of Robert some years ago when he gave a presentation at USC. And then again, when the church he founded with his wife called Jesus for Revolutionaries, and if you have a church called Jesus for Revolutionaries, you better have your stuff together, was a case study for one of our projects. I love that name, and it signals significantly what you're doing. Our second conversation partner today is Rabbi Sharon Brous, who is the founding rabbi of IKAR, a leading edge Jewish community in LA that seeks to inspire people across the religious spectrum. And I believe we sent out with the announcement a link to her TED Talk. So you should look at that if you have not. I feel like because it's very interesting, and I feel like I've had a 1 degree of separation relationship with Rabbi Brous for several years, since several of my friends are members of her congregations, and other friends know and have worked with her, but I've never met her until today. So if you haven't watched the TED Talk, one of the things she does is she gets exactly at the issue that we're interested in, is reimagining and reclaiming religion from those who want to claim it in their acts of extremism and violence, and whether that violence is symbolic or on the ground violence. And third is Pastor Stephen Q. Jean-Marie, who is, among many other leadership positions and in organizations working for social justice, and a recording artist, the pastor of the Row LA, otherwise known as the Church Without Walls, in LA's Skid Row community. Most recently, like just a couple of weeks ago, Pastor Q was featured on CNN's United Shades of America with W. Kamau Bell, being interviewed about his work here in LA. And if you can't find that episode online anywhere, you can watch a video we made of Pastor Q just a couple of years ago by going to our website, which is crcc.usc.edu. And in the search field, that little magnifying glass, just type in the Row and click on the link that will come up. And my last introduction before we get into the conversation is my friend and colleague, Reverend Najuma Smith-Pollard, who will be moderating the discussion. Reverend Najuma came up under the ministry of Reverend Cecil Murray, and in her own way is continuing the legacy of faith-rooted justice work that Reverend Murray established in LA. So Najuma, I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to send it on to you, and then we'll come back after that.
So I'm really excited to be on with everyone. And Bree has put in the chat for us the segment on United Shades. So if you want to cut and paste that or put it in your search engine, it's available for you. So I'm excited, like Richard Flory said, to be in discussion with each of you today. And so let's get started. We're gonna just dive in with the first kind of question, and we'll pass it. I'll start with my friend, Rabbi Sharon Brous, and we're talking today about the relationship between seeking social justice and developing a thriving congregation. Rabbi Sharon Brous, tell us, what is that relationship between seeking social justice and developing a thriving congregation? And I just want us to talk like all of us are friends, and everybody else just happens to be at the dinner table with us.
Okay, and I can't wait until we can sit at the dinner table together again, hopefully in the not too distant future. Good morning, everyone. I'm so grateful to be with all of you. Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you, Pastor Q. Good to see you and be with you. And Professor Romero, I'm really eager to learn with you and from you, and my dear friend, Reverend Najuma Smith-Pollard, who I continue to find inspiration from every time we speak. So I'll just say very briefly that I've been speaking a lot over the last couple of months about what it means to live in the moment that we're living through right now, with the particular confluence of crises that we are experiencing in our country. Obviously, the global health crisis, the economic crisis, the crisis of racial injustice and racial terror and violence, the environmental devastation, and the crisis of democracy. And there are more. I mean, the list could go on and on. And what is the particular pain point from all of these intersecting crises? How do we care for and love our people when there's so much on the line right now? And what is the opportunity with all of these crises? How can we see this moment as an inflection point, as a possible opportunity for the transformation of our society, to really root out, to speak honestly about, to reckon with, and then to root out a lot of the toxins that have been in our nation from before it even was formally established. And I will say that I'm now speaking with a historian who's working with Jewish archives in New York, and where she's doing a series of interviews to try to understand where rabbis and congregations are in this moment. And she asked me to try to remember back to the world in January of 2020 and what was on my mind at that point. And I realized that at that point, I very much felt that the world was in crisis, and that we were standing in the intersection of multiple crises, and that we had an incredible opportunity to lay to rest a world of iniquity, of white supremacy, of human cruelty and callousness, and to birth a new multiracial democracy. And in some ways, all that the last 7 months have done is lifted up these issues in the most dramatic form, so that many people now feel as though the veil's been lifted, and they can see now what other people have really seen and been wrestling with and struggling with for many decades or many centuries even. So that what is the job of a faith leader and the job of a congregation in this moment? We have to be both pastor and prophet. We have to tend to the wounds of the hearts of our community members who are in incredible anguish and pain right now. And we have to look systemically. We have to think about what this moment offers us in terms of an opportunity for real transformation, and really step into that void with as much courage and as much strength as we can, because I do believe that it's an inflection point and an opportunity for us. And I'll just close by sharing with you one line that comes from one of my teachers, Rabbi Leonard Bierman, who some of you may know. He was really one of the great rabbis of the previous generation. And I'm happy to share more about him in a moment as we get into our conversation. But he gave an extraordinary sermon on the eve of Yom Kippur in the year 1972. And he speaks directly to this question. So if it's okay, Najuma, do I have time to read? I want to share with you just this one quote, because I think it will help lead us into the conversation that we're about to have. But he says, when we try to be serious about our task, we know that what we say will not only comfort, but also disturb. He said, I have no burning desire to disturb you or to upset you, but I am convinced that there are enough sedatives and tranquilizers traversing the bloodstreams of the members of this congregation alone without adding to their number. There are enough clergy around to perform this role. As a model for this, one should go to the East Room of the White House on a Sunday morning, where each week 200 or 300 invited guests, especially token priests and pastors, all of them solid, respectable, all of them give their blessings to whatever it is that the president is doing. This was 1972. He said, wherever it appears, in the White House, in churches, in synagogues, this is not authentic religion. Wherever religion does no more than sedate and tranquilize, it becomes a drug, a snare, a delusion. And it feels to me that our communities, faith communities, are absolutely called into the streets right now. We are called to be the leaders of the revolution that's taking place across this country and across the world. And if we fail to do that, we're only creating more of a drug, a snare, a delusion for our congregation, when what they need is to be led to take their place in history.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, Rabbi Brous. And I want to kind of say, I want to tag Q on this one, because he'll get it, and I'm sure a lot of you will. You use the word, or the relationship right now is that our role as faith leaders is to be pastor and prophet. The interesting about that word prophet, or even prophetic, and Pastor Q, I want you to chime in on this one, is in some spaces, pastor, to be prophetic or to be a prophet kind of goes back to that notion of what Rabbi Berman was speaking about sedating people, about, kind of just saying what people want to hear. And a lot of church is guilty of that. And so maybe I'm wondering, Pastor Q, do we have to even also begin to reimagine what it means to be prophetic? Because you and I know when those words prophet or prophetic are used in some spaces, people think that means something about telling someone about their future, that they're going to get a car or that they're going to get married. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Talk to that a little bit, Pastor Q, and then also, what are your thoughts about the relationship between about thriving congregations and social justice?
Well, I can't think about the concept of prophet without thinking of James Cone. James Cone says that theology is not it's not God's speech, but it's human speech. It is what we say about God, and oftentimes it is influenced by our culture. So, being that most of our commentaries are written by Euro-Americans, our concept of prophet is skewed anyway, right? And so, I think that when we think about the prophetic voice, I think we don't go to the street. Rabbi Sharon Brous talked about the streets. You don't go to the streets to be a prophet. You go to the streets because you are a prophet. And it reminds me of how I got involved with Black Lives Matter LA in 2013. I went to pray with Dr. Melina Abdullah at the police, in front of the police station, where the police had barriers up so that the people couldn't come in. And I went to pray with her there. And to me, that was the work of a prophet. And I also knew that the police commission had the ear of the church, right? The police commission, because the church always wants to work with power. But is there a time when we don't need to work with power and we force power to work with us, right? I think that's something we need to consider as we think about.
That's awesome. About demanding that power works with us. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
Pastor.
And not just work with us. I mean, we only wanted power to work with us because we were serving the people, and the people were telling us how they were feeling. And Jesus often had his hands on the pulse of how people were feeling and their emotions and what they were going through. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes the church is more systemic in its operation rather than being prophetic.
Wow. That's good. Thank you for that, Pastor Q. Robert, come on, jump on in here. And for those that don't know, we put in the chat Robert's book, Brown Church, Centuries, Theology, Identity. I may be saying that wrong. Give us the title of the book, but the link is in the chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Reverend.
Thank you, Robert.
Okay, well, thank you, first of all, for this chance to learn from Rabbi Sharon and Pastor Q. And I got to give a special shout out to Pastor Q, because he gave me my start When I started as a young professor at UCLA 15 years ago, I remember one of the first things I did was ask Pastor Q to come to my office and to pray, and then he gave me my shot in ministry, and so here we are, very special, and thank you, CRCC and Reverend and Richard for the invitation to be here today. Two wings of a plane, that's what I'll say to start in terms of the question. Reverend Renee Padilla spoke about how a thriving congregation has to be like a plane with two wings, One wing has to be the wing of personal transformation that comes through faith, character transformation, personal emotional healing, and so forth. And the second is loving our neighbor and justice and embodying, that good news. And if you're missing one wing or the other, as we say in Spanish, no sirve. It doesn't work. The plane doesn't fly. I think that's what we're experiencing now in the United States today, is like the plane, to speak of my own context, the plane of American Christianity is crashing. And to speak more specifically about my context, millions of Latinx millennials and Gen X are jumping out of the plane because they're like, this plane's not working, right? How can my pastor, how can my church stay silent when, pastors and kids and students are being, deported and put in cages and so on and so forth? How can we be silent? And that leads to this spiritual, well, first of all, it leads to grave human suffering, which is the worst. And then it leads to, as Richard was saying in his opening remarks, this vacuum of identity that millions of young Latinx folks are experiencing now. And I talk to them all throughout the country, and they're like, how do I reconcile being a follower of Jesus and this passion for justice? And I think that a thriving congregation, it might think that it's just sort of just a slight oversight to ignore justice, but it leads to very grave consequences. And that's when I talk with students all the time about this vacuum. And lastly, I'll say that I bring my UCLA work together as a historian to this conversation and a pastor by saying there is actually a 500-year history of Latina social justice, 500 years. And that for all these young people who feel like they don't belong, they do belong. They belong to the Brown Church.
I was taking notes, Robert. Thank you. That was awesome. And I was writing down something you said, that our oversight as thriving congregations to engage social justice work will lead to grave consequences. And what went to my mind was grave consequences for who, right? Because that seems to be sometimes the tipping point for whether people will engage or not. Is this really a problem for me? And I want you to jump in on this, Rabbi Brous, because you lead a very affluent congregation, but you're also very intentional in engaging your congregation to be engaged, even in issues that may not really, where there may not be consequences for them. So speak to that issue as it relates to the role of congregations engaging social justice work when it actually may not necessarily affect you personally or your front door. And then I want to invite Robert to come back in and Pastor Q to jump in as well, talk about the grave consequences and what does it look like for thriving congregations to engage in social justice work, because there are grave consequences, and what those grave consequences look like. Go ahead, Rabbi Brous.
Well, I think it's a really interesting question that I think comes down to our understanding of what self-interest is. Do we think that self-interest is only the immediate threat or immediate danger that we and our immediate family members face, or do we see ourselves as part of a broader collective in which if one limb of this body is aching, then the body's not well? And it doesn't matter if this hand feels great, if this hand doesn't work, I'm in pain. And when we launched our community, and by the way, it's not, I mean, there's a very big spectrum, socioeconomically in the community. But when we launched the community, the community's CBCO, our congregational-based community organizing many years ago, the key teaching that we wanted to bring to our community is not what affects you immediately. In our Jewish tradition, we have this idea of your dalet amot. It's like your 4 hands breaths, and that's your personal responsibility. And what happens when you look beyond your dalet amot and you recognize that we are all part of a broader body together, and so how do we expand our notion of self-interest so that it's not just I'm concerned about my child or my parent or myself, but I understand that when you're unwell, I am also unwell. And I will say that historically in the United States, Jews tend to vote against their own best economic self-interest. So that's why, I mean, about 80% of Jews will historically vote Democratic, even if the tax policies that Republicans are proponents of are more advantageous for people in certain wealth categories. And I think the reason why is because of this understanding of self-interest. So I've been preaching this way for many years. And of course, there's some people in the community who come because they like the music, they come because that's where their friends go. But they have to hear me preach when they come. That's the price they have to pay to come in. And one of the people who was always very resistant to the justice message in my community called me in tears one day after they dropped their child off for college in New York City and said, I think I understand now what you're talking about, because basically when you put your child out into the world, you have to trust and hope and believe that there will be goodness in the world and that the world will be just, because you can't protect anymore in this way. And so what does it mean to work only for my own interest? My interest is everyone. I care about all of us and our well-being. So I think that's kind of the core message. And by the way, in the very early days of the pandemic, we were speaking a Torah of interconnectedness in this country and around the world like I had never heard it before in the main stage. People were talking about how a tiny, invisible germ cell had traveled all the way across the world and infected immediately every single part. You could see that from the spread of the virus, how connected we are to each other. So one person's reckless or irresponsible behavior has an impact on someone else's chances of living and thriving and surviving. When guns are sold in one state, they cross the border and can kill people in another. When large corporations dump sludge into the waterways, people who live miles and miles away are now going to be drinking bad water. What we do affects and impacts one another, whether we like to think that or not. And when we live in a healthy, vibrant society, we all benefit from it. So I think the job of this moment is about expanding our understanding of self-interest so that we're working for the collective good. And we understand that is in my immediate good too.
Amen. We felt you on that one, Rabbi Brous. Absolutely. And I love the idea, and I'm hoping you are taking notes, expanding the notion of self-interest. Robert, let's go to you, and then Pastor Q, I want you to jump in on this about the grave consequences when congregations are not engaged in social justice, and what does it look like to engage these grave consequences? Robert?
Sure. Yeah, I'm still stuck on that 80% of the Jewish community votes against its economic interest. I wish that was the Latino community. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. I think that first, one of the grave consequences, like say to take immigration for example, is that we suffer, right? I remember a student of mine coming to me after class one day and saying, Professor Romero, can you give me your slides for the last 3 lectures? I'm like, okay, sure, what happened? This is right after the election and new immigration policies were being implemented. And she said, my mom has papers, but there was a workplace raid, I think is what happened. And she got swept up because she was brown. And I had to go home to watch my siblings so that my dad could find my mom. And it took 4 days to find her. Those terrible consequences. I think of the case surrounding Pastor Noé Carillas several years ago, and many people on this call we're so grateful we're involved in that campaign to set him free. But Pastor Noé is a Assemblies of God pastor. And, he came to the U.S. as a child refugee from the civil wars of the 80s. And he was arrested, and he was going to be separated from his family. And the potential is, as that happened, as many within the Latino Pentecostal community saw that, oh my gosh, wow, this affects us. This is a pastor. This could be me. It was beautiful to see the Latino Pentecostal community of millions of people from here to Brazil come together and to fuse Latino Pentecostal and religious practices like fasting and prayer and all those kind of things with like nonviolent social practices and teachings from like Chavez and King, with community organizing practices. And it was so amazing to see, like, you had these pastors, again, who never would have been involved with social justice before, but they were leading prayer vigils in front of ICE headquarters, right, for 1 week straight. And they were having prayer gatherings on Friday nights, and everyone's laying hands and everything in East Los Angeles. And they were writing letters to the head of ICE, who was Catholic, and writing him like Bible verses and stuff like that. And it was amazing to see how that brought together also a multicultural community, including many people on this call, an interfaith community to come alongside Pastor Noe. And it was amazing the day that he was set free. I remember getting the call. We were at the end of our rope, and we thought, oh my gosh, there's nothing more we could do. We get the call, and we drive to Adelanto with like Pastor Noe's family, and my kids even went. And it was like, wow, this is amazing. Like, when you fuse faith and the local role of the church and the community cultural wealth of communities of color as well, amazing things happen.
Thank you for that, Pastor Romero. Thank you. Q, Pastor Q, grave consequences.
Yeah, well, I think it creates a vulnerable society, right? Those who are marginalized, they are vulnerable when we don't, as the church, engage in social justice. What do I mean by that? We think about how COVID-19 disproportionately affected Black folks in the very beginning. Mm-hmm. And then it began to disproportionately affect brown folks.
Yeah.
So our society has already been vulnerable to begin with. And Black folks are usually the gauge to any ills of our society will affect Black folks most adversely. And then we see that our brown folks who are picking our fruits and were continuing to work and being placed in situations where their health were at risk, then they started contracting COVID-19 at a high rate. So the entire society lends itself, it's not healthy. Our society is vulnerable, it's not healthy, it's infected with more than just racism and COVID-19. We know that we're dealing with, California went from the 6th largest economy in the world to the 5th largest economy in the world in 2018, with the widest income gap between the rich and the working poor. But then we have rich churches, right? And churches who are saying, well, let's focus on a certain demographic of people, because those are the people that will come to our church. And so even the way we do ministry is segregated in our society, right? Because we're saying, let's, like Saddleback Sam, or you know what I'm saying? That's the way we do ministry. And so I think when we do ministry like a service to folks who want to be comfortable, then it's really dangerous for the oppressed, because they are the ones who get forgotten in the process.
Thank you for that, Pastor Q. And I think about, you brought up the word vulnerable, and I think of the word Jesus talks about, the least of these. Mm-hmm. And that would be the equivalent, is most vulnerable would be the equivalent of the least of these. And we have to constantly center who's the most vulnerable. That's part of, even in when I, not that I learned this in seminary, I actually didn't learn this in seminary, I learned it outside of after seminary, but when you look at text, and I'm not sure if this applies to any other tradition, but I welcome that input. But one of the ways I was trained is that when you look in the text, scripture, you don't just look at the obvious, right? You don't just see who's listed and who's named, but you look at the person that's left out, right? Who's left out of the conversation, who's made most vulnerable in the text, who's not mentioned, right? Who's overlooked. And that's the way to properly examine the text, to make a full application of it. It's not just to say, okay, Jesus and the disciples, but who are the people that's watching and listening, and what's going on for them. And that's one of the ways I've been trained to look at my faith as well as social justice. Is like, the text may not necessarily mention, the issue of immigration, but they're in there. You just got to look deeper. You got to dig deeper, and you got to ask the text some questions. Who's missing? Who's not listed? Who's not named? Who's remaining unnamed? So I don't know if that applies to any other faith tradition, but I welcome that. But I want to encourage all of us as faith leaders, when we look at our text, to ask some questions of who's the least of these in the text, who's the most vulnerable, who's not mentioned. Go ahead, Pastor Q. You were going to say something?
No, go ahead. I was going to say something, but I think you hit it.
Amen. And you brought up something, Pastor Q, about division. And I want to kind of shift in that direction. And then after, I want to hear from everybody, all of our panelists. And then we're going to do something called pair share. So all of you will be broken up into pair share groups, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that is in a moment. But I wanted to get into a discussion about the division, because what we see, and you lifted this or led into this, Pastor Q, a division in church. And when we say church or congregations, we're talking about all faith traditions. So what's the role, right, for those that get it and those that don't get it? How do we work through that division? How do we bridge it? How do we mend it, heal it, fix it? What is, because there are faith leaders on, and they may be experiencing division within their own congregation or with their own community, where there might be some who have a desire to engage some social justice issues, and others who are saying, well, that's not our issue, or that's not our interest. And so sometimes that's local, and then sometimes it's, within denominations. And then of course we see like on this national scale. So your thoughts, and I'd love to hear from you, Robert, and then Rabbi Brous.
Yeah, well, definitely when we think about division, we can't deal, like Carter G. Woodson says, we can't really deal with a situation, and I'm paraphrasing, in the now without knowing the then, right? Where it came from, right? So when we think about division, you are part of the First AME Church. Absalom Jones, right? When they left the Methodist Church and became the first African Methodist Episcopal Church because of racism, right? The division in the church, there has never been folks have been trying to do what they call multicultural ministry, but we've never had a true multicultural church in America, because I'm reminded of when I pastored in Irvine with Pastor Dave Gibbons, and he preached a message, and there's 27 different Asian groups in the church, and Pastor Dave says, a lot of you guys, Q is my friend, and a lot of you guys love Q, but I guarantee you, if your daughter came home with a black man, it would be a totally different story. And he was talking to a lot of groups. And I think what we have to understand about division is that the content or the context creates the division, right? So the context of racism, the context of bigotry, it's kind of like growing a plant. You have to have the right environment for that plant. So I think the context creates a lot of the division that we're dealing with. And we're in a society where the context, a lot of folks are asking, like, America is suddenly a divided place. No, I say America was covertly divided. Now it's overtly divided.
Wow.
Now it's overtly divided because this is the reason we went to the street. I was a rapper. I was a hip hop artist who was signed to Virgin Records. My hit single was called Victim of the Ghetto. Mm-hmm. Sold mostly in places, hip hop sold 70% of hip hop was sold to Euro Americans, mm-hmm. right? White folks bought most of the hip hop music, but College Boys music, our record called Victim of the Ghetto, was sold mostly in rural places, mm-hmm. like Monroe, Louisiana. You know what I'm saying? Where they come into the club with a 80-ounce bottle of beer, and if you don't sing the song they want to hear, they'll throw it at you. Mm-hmm. You know, so coming into the church, I had that particular perspective, mm-hmm. and that's why we started the church without walls, because I'm like, ain't nobody reaching the folks that I know. Ain't nobody reaching the folks that I used to perform to, mm-hmm. right? Nobody's reaching to these folks. And so that's why we started the church without walls. And when I say without walls, I'm talking about without walls in every way, including structure.
Yeah, they literally have no walls, y'all. You should go one Friday night. Thank you, Pastor Q. Robert, jump on in on this about division. What are ways that faith leaders can work through this issue of division within the faith space?
Sure. To speak just kind of from the very diverse Latino context, and then to hone in on the one that I'm a part of, which is sort of Protestant, Latino, Pentecostal kind of thing. Well, first of all, I think as Latinos, we've been divided for 500 years, because in Latin America, we came from a context where being Spanish, quote unquote, was like the goal. That was our racial goal, right? And everyone tried to fight to be in that category. And that created systems that divided everyone to this very day, where those of indigenous and Black and mixed race descent are lower on the racial hierarchy. And to this day, people many Latinos, you meet them and within 30 seconds, they'll say, I'm Spanish. Even though no one in their family has been to Spain probably like in 400 years. And even though they might have other heritage that we should be proud of as well. And so then we bring that to the United States, and we're brown. And in the United States for the past 200 years, we're metaphorically brown, because as Latinos, we come in all different shades, right? Brown, fair, blonde, dark hair. But what we have in common is that in US society, whether it's in the church or in economics or in politics, we've always been in between black and white, right? Metaphorically brown. And also, for the last 150 years, if we had enough money, enough education, then we could bust a Ted Cruz. Right? We can go, boop, I'm gonna gain honorary whiteness to a limited extent. And that's what you see in the churches today, in many Latino churches, people fighting to assimilate, right? And the youth are seeing through that. One of the ways that we try to break this down is sort of, first of all, to let people know the history of that, and that goes a long way, sharing the stories, and then secondly, but in very practical terms, like in the current moment, like how do we get churches involved in issues of justice? We'd go to like churches that would not ordinarily get involved with justice and share the stories, lots of stories, right, of how, and then go to the Bible, right? What are those 2,000 verses in the Bible that talk about, justice and God's heart for the poor and immigrants, and that's the best bridge that I've found so far.
Thank you. And I have I love the part about you said about sharing stories, and stories are so powerful. And Rabbi Brous, I know that's one of the ways in which you communicate with your congregation is the storytelling. So talk to us about this bridging the divide within congregations and faith spaces, and what are some stories that you lean into?
Well, I'm so moved by the honesty and bluntness with which you just shared that, Professor Romero, that the drive toward honorary whiteness. And I can tell you, I mean, the Jewish community is complex and actually is a multiracial community. About 12 to 20% of American Jews are people of color, which is something that is just astonishing for many people because they think of American Jews as all Ashkenazi, white, European descent. And even still, there's a really important story to be told about white Jews becoming white Americans first and foremost. And that's a challenge in our community, coming to terms with that. I mean, I will say, and I know you're speaking in a much broader context, but just to speak very particularly to the Jewish community for a moment, because of the nature of Jewish trauma, there's a sense of vulnerability that Jews carry with us because of the generational trauma and because of the nature of the way we've learned again and again that history can change in an instant, and you often thrive and succeed and even rise in the ranks to almost the highest levels of power, and then in an instant there's a genocide, an exile, an expulsion. Everything you knew to be true is turned on its head. So all of the accumulation of wealth, of power, of connection, it doesn't do very much to ease the mind of many Jews who feel still in existential kind of vulnerability. And that's something that's hard for a lot of people to understand, because they say, like, look at your house and you have 2 cars and you have and you've got a pension and you're doing fine. Why do you feel so scared all the time? And I think at the heart of that is the particular nature of Jewish trauma, and the way that anti-Semitism has worked over the course of a very long time throughout history. We've learned the lesson. It's like it's living in the DNA now. Don't ever get too comfortable, because again and again and again, we understand how everything can turn on its head, and nobody in the world will stand up to protect you. So that's kind of at the heart of it. And I think that that for a lot of Jews, so that there are 2 ways to respond to that story. How do you hold a kind of Holocaust mentality, a post-Holocaust generation mentality, when you're living in a world of incredible injustice and iniquities? And many Jews, American Jews, can take the kind of path toward, I'm going to leave behind, I don't need to look at where the pain and suffering lives, because I can now live into the white part of my identity and just be comfortable and safe. I think that there are multiple choice. There are really 2 paths that you can take. I mean, you can either say, because of my history and what's happened to me and to my people, I will take the ride toward kind of a carefree engagement that gives me access to power and privilege, etc. Because look what the world did to me, and nobody gave a damn, and so it's not my job to give a damn. Or the opposite of that, which is what we obviously work to live into, and the story that we tell, which is the story that the Hebrew Bible tells, which is, because you were enslaved in Egypt, because nobody gave a damn about you, it is your first and last responsibility to look out for the stranger, for the oppressed, for the enslaved. And your job is to always to reach out and to do everything in your power to build a more just society, so that nobody else has to suffer the way that you've suffered. I want to acknowledge that it is a choice, right? That we all have to choose what to do with our trauma. And it is possible to make the choice to live into our own power and privilege and not to engage. And it is, and yet I believe it says, it says one time that you can't cook a kid, and twice that you can't cook a kid in its mother's milk. We shouldn't mix milk and meat. The prohibitions on sexual relationships, how many times do those appear? Once or twice, depending on what you're looking at. But 36 times it says that you should not oppress the stranger, that you must love the stranger as yourself. Why? Because you know the heart of the stranger, because you were enslaved in Egypt. And so it feels really clear to me that while we as human beings always have a choice, that our tradition is telling us this is the right choice, right? There's a right way to live as a trauma survivor, and there's a wrong way to live. And the right way to live, our tradition seems to be telling us very clearly, is to take the pain that we've experienced and work to build a more just and loving society. And so How do we engage a community where there are different choices that people can be making, a quest for power or a quest for justice? And here's where, Najuma, I mean, many times we've talked about this, but the story that we tell that is the central narrative of our people, and a story that's a core narrative also in Christianity and also in Islam, this is the narrative of the Exodus from Egypt becomes the most important story, the meta narrative of our people. And we're constantly revisiting it. Traditional Jews will tell this story 3 times a day in our liturgy. And we tell it every single week when we enter Shabbat, when the sun goes down, and we say, Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. Why are we having Shabbat? In order to remember that we were enslaved people in Egypt. And what happens when we see the new moon? We remember that we were enslaved in Egypt. Every single holiday, every single opportunity, because we understand that it's building in a reflex of love into a society of cruelty, that our work is to build justice and love because we know what it has been like. And even if right now we're not in a chapter of suffering, we were and we will be again. And so our job is to work to make the world a more just place with everything we've got in the meantime.
Yes, indeed. I would like to, that was just so awesome. I would like to just chime in on that. I think when we talk about that, I love the story of the Exodus that Rabbi Sharon Brous just brought up, because it reminds me of the fact that America, that's the problem with America now is, and the church, is that it wants to suppress Black folks, Egypt, right? It wants to suppress the story of Black people who came here in chains, right? America wants to suppress that story. The very phrase Black Lives Matter brings that story to the surface, and America doesn't want to deal with that. And I think in order to deal with our division, we have to really change the context, right? We have to change the context of our society and make it a healthier society. One of the things we have to do is we have to decolonize our theology. Because one of the reasons we have all of these evangelicals who are saying, like, people who are saying that if you don't vote for Trump, you're not a Christian. Right? We have to decolonize our theology, right? And I say that because some of those people have written great commentaries about the Bible, but how many of the commentaries are written by people of color? All of those commentaries are written by Europeans. So, and it reminds me of that story, right? When we talked about last week, when folks were saying that BLM was a witchcraft, which practicing witchcraft because we call on the ancestors and we pour libations and we say that the ancestors, the spirit of the ancestors will show up in the midst of our protest. They call that witchcraft. But the last time I checked on the Mount of Configuration, Moses and Elijah showed up, right? And even Jesus said that John the Baptist was Elijah. Right? So John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah. So I think decolonizing our theology is going to help a lot with our division.
Thank you for that, Pastor Q, and thank you, Pastor Rabbi. I'm going to call you Pastor Brous, Rabbi Brous, but you're a pastor in ways. I want to add this to the piece about the storytelling, and I want to invite everyone who's participating with us today to visit the story of your ancestors and your families, because the truth is, within our families, within our history, maybe very personal, there are stories of oppression, there are stories of otherizing. So you actually don't have, when we decolonize, to your point, Pastor Q, and when we tell the truth, which is the point of telling stories, is to tell the truth, truth telling. That's what prophets do. They tell the truth.
Come on now.
All of us have within our stories, in our family history, in our narratives, stories of oppression. So you don't actually have to always look at somebody else. You can actually just take a truthful look down your own memory lane, and you will find those stories that we hope would bring all of us forward in moments like these to say, my faith challenges me to get engaged in social justice, not because it's just the other but because it's also been me. It's also been my family. It's been my heritage, my ancestors, et cetera, et cetera. So, and part of the decolonizing is to tell the truth about that. Because the colonizing has reframed the truth to have them believe that some have always had it, and that's not true, and some have never had it, and that's not true either. So revisit your stories of your families and your own heritage and your own ancestry, and you will find those narratives of oppression that can help bring all of us forward in moments like these to say, this is why I must engage social justice, because it's not just the other, it's also me too. And so I'm going to turn it back over to you, Richard Flory, but thank you, everyone. Thank you to all of our panelists. We certainly appreciate each and every one of you, and make sure to follow them on social media, and let's continue the conversation. Our next session will be October the 7th, Politics, Division, Elections, and Thriving Congregations. We hope to see all of you back with us and some more folks, because we really, really, really want to come through this season and thrive. And Sharon, also share with us the link to IKAR, your High Holy Days, because I know you all do some of your sessions, some of your programming live, or they're up on the, so put that in there, because I know you'll be doing some speaking soon in preparation, as we lead into this season. So Richard Flory, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Najuma. Thank you for leading a great discussion. I want to really thank each of our three panelists for a really enjoyable and thought-provoking discussion. Robert, Pastor Q, Rabbi Sharon, and particularly Rabbi Sharon, I know that you're in the middle of preparation for the High Holy Days. Thanks for taking this time to join us. And I look forward to seeing people actually in person one of these days, hopefully sooner than later. Thank all the rest of you for participating. There's never enough time to talk about all the important things that come up, but what we want these to do is be a catalyst to conversations ongoing. One of the first comments that came out of the pair share was, it's going to happen through conversations, and I think that's true. And this part of what we want to do is start to establish these kinds of relationships across churches and other faith communities in the Los Angeles area, and who knows what can happen after that. As Najuma said, as a reminder, the next conversation will be the last one for the fall, is before the election. It's on October 7th, and we're going to talk specifically about the election and how it's going to relate to congregations. And Tim's question was key, because we know there are divisions within congregations and within faith traditions over these kinds of issues. And I think that's important to bring to the fore and to talk about. So keep an eye out for emails from us. We'll keep you informed not only about that conversation, but then also as this initiative develops. And we are in the process of planning for what we're going to do after the new year. We're going to give you November and December off. Hopefully that won't be a period of mourning after the election, but you never know. And finally, thank you again, and we will see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.